Good evening and welcome to the ATP Report with your host, Barry Newsbaum. You say, what does ATP stand for? American Truth Project, and your host is Barry Newsbaum. Barry, thank you for joining us for your very first program here at WVW Broadcast Network.
It's a thrill to be with you. I'm very happy to have you.
Well, we're honored that you're broadcasting with us and speaking truth. Now, you are Jewish, and we're going to bring that up and make that an issue because we here at WVW Broadcast Network are Zionists. We're not just Zionists, we're Christian Zionists. And so we believe not on the legal right, but in the spiritual right of the people of Israel to possess the land. And as I know you know, historically, evangelical Christians have been some of the biggest supporters of Israel. We are very concerned that that is waning due to bad theology in our Protestant churches with replacement theology that says that God is done with the people of Israel and he has given those promises to the church. And so we won't get into all those theological discussions other than to say there's a lot going on in the Protestant world, and we often like to highlight our Jewish friends about what's happening in Israel so that we can warn more and more of the people in the Protestant world, the conservative world, the Jewish world, all those groups, what's happening, because there is an information warfare going on and lots of lies about the Jewish state of Israel. They're an apartheid state, they're racist, they're killing the Palestinians, and all these lies that I know you'll be able to destroy. So let's get right to it. First of all, Barry, a very historic week. Donald Trump signs an executive order in the White House a couple days ago. Tell me about this executive order. What does it do and why is it important?
It is an incredible milestone in American Jewish relations, American Jewish and Israel relations, and most importantly, as you and I have spoken, Brannon, an American president has stood up for the Jewish people and the people of Israel in a way that no president has done, maybe since President Truman was the first to recognize the state of Israel in 1948. Basically, what Trump did, which seems, Brannon, like a no-brainer, but he's the first president to do it, is to stand up and say, if you're going to be on a college or university campus and you're going to take federal funds, then you sure as heck better not be promoting anti-Semitism or we're going to cut the money off. Now, it seems like that should be, like I said, an automatic, but it took President Trump to do it.
Well, it does seem automatic, doesn't it? And there was a great ceremony. I watched it live from the White House over the television, as I'm sure you did as well. And I saw a lot of faces and names and people I recognized. And I even saw a Democrat who I think voted for Hillary Clinton take the podium, Alan Dershowitz, a Jewish gentleman in his 80s, who I think, again, is a Democrat that voted for Hillary. And he praised Donald Trump and said this was a major historic moment. And he's in his 80s, and he was really praising this. So maybe even some of our Jewish Democratic friends will now see the seriousness of the moment and start supporting this president when it comes at least to the issue of the nation state of Israel and the Jewish people.
Oh, absolutely. Alan Dershowitz is probably the most preeminent constitutional scholar in America today. As you said, he is a lifelong Democrat. I think he would vote for a Republican if there was nobody else running, but only under those circumstances. But he stood up to say, thank you, President Trump, for recognizing that American colleges and universities have become bastions of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias because of the BDS movement. And Trump said, enough's enough. No more Israel bashing. And if you bash Israel under the guise of, well, we're just not Zionists, but we do like Jews, what you're really saying is we don't like Jews and we're going to hide that prejudice behind smashing the state of Israel.
And, you know, I even think, somebody used the BDS, did they not? Someone used that term in the press conference. Someone brought up BDS. Was that Trump or who brought up BDS? Do you remember?
I believe Trump said it, and he said it frequently in the past. For your viewers that don't know the term, let me just spend a second on that. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. It is a pro-Palestinian, pro-Arabist anti-Israel movement started by an Arab named Omar Bagudi, and he's still the head of it, and he makes no bones about his purpose. He says loudly and proudly for everyone to hear, the purpose of BDS is the destruction of the state of Israel. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is their motto, which means the River Jordan, which is the eastern boundary of Israeli territory, depending on which map you look at. And the western boundary is the Mediterranean Sea. And as far as these people are concerned, that area should be Judean-free, meaning no Jews, no state of Israel. It should be Arab.
Well, and sadly, Barry, a lot of so-called evangelicals are buying into the BDS movement. They have something in Bethlehem every year for many years called Christ at the Checkpoint, where they bring in all these anti-Semitic so-called evangelicals. I guess the antithesis of Zionism, or Christian Zionism, the antithesis of that would be what is called Christian Palestinianism. And they carry out the very same lies as Hamas. They've even had a Hamas representative speak there, as we have covered on our other broadcast. So again, this is why it's so important discussing this with you, a man who comes from a Jewish heritage and family that is very much concerned about what is happening, many of the issues of the 1930s, the anti-Semitism, the boycotting being repeated. You had family that died in the Holocaust, did you not?
Oh, absolutely. As you know the story, I'll recount it for your viewers briefly. My family is from Hungary. When the Holocaust had started, as you know, it started in terms of mass murder in Poland. My mother used to ask her father in Hungary, "Are we safe here?" And meaning in Hungary, outside of Budapest. And my grandfather used to tell my mother, "Oh yes, that's a Polish problem. It's over there. We're safe here." And they believed that until the time the Gestapo truck pulled up onto their front yard and took away my grandfather, my uncle. They were going to take away the grandmother and the aunt, but they pleaded to just take my grandfather and my uncle. They both died in Auschwitz. My grandmother died there, and eventually my mother and my father went to Auschwitz and were lucky enough to survive until liberation in 1945. So yeah, I've got a very personal, historical family history with what happens with a movement that starts with, as you pointed out so astutely, you're obviously a historian, with a boycott of Jewish businesses. And that's how Hitler started it in the mid-1930s.
And it was called the Night of the Broken Glass, or Crystal Knot, the Night of the Broken Glass. Many believe that was the beginning of the Holocaust, as they, of course, up to that point, they'd been going around spraying the Jewish businesses with a Star of David, making them wear the Star of David on their clothes, identifying them. So they were marginalized, they were characterized, they were vilified. They legalized all of that and made it legal to steal their civil liberties. Marginalize, characterize, legalize, vilify, all of that. It seems to be being repeated today, making it legal to persecute the Jews and also the Christians. And this time I think it's going to be many Christians and Jews and conservatives as well. Maybe even some folks that don't consider themselves religious but politically conservative, because after all, that is what is really the target. Christianity, Judaism, and capitalism. So if you're a capitalist, you say, well, I'm not Jewish, I'm not really religious, but I'm a capitalist. Well, you're in the target zone, folks, because it's the Judeo-Christian worldview and capitalism. And that is seen as the source of all suffering and oppression. And the Old Testament that the Jews follow, of course, discusses the issue of private property and Israel and capitalism, or what we call free market principles. We know the Christians believe that same thing in the Old Testament. They follow also the New Testament. They see it repeated there. We see it, both of us see it in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. So the Christians and the Jews are seen as being people who are more prone to capitalists. Not that all Jews are, not that all Christians are. We have many Christians, so-called Christians running around today. They're anti-Semitic, they're promoting socialism, but historically a Judeo-Christian worldview includes an appreciation of and promotion of the nation state of Israel, as well as capitalism and freedom. And so the target are Christians, conservatives, and Jews and capitalists. Are you one of those? Then you're the target too. And so what you must do is oppress those people, marginalize, characterize, and target them. And that's what's happening. And so we know that the night of the broken glass, crystal knock, they went around and broke their shop windows, hauled some of them off to concentration camps that very night, murdered many of them, I think destroyed some 267 synagogues, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. And this really set up what was the beginning of what many say is the Holocaust. But it started with a boycott. Now, Barry, you and I know that Israel is providing fruit and flowers to the world. They provide technology to the world. If we use a thumb drive, if we use a cell phone, if we use medical devices, GPS, we can thank the Jewish state of Israel and Jewish scientists and engineers and free market principle guys and gals. I bet a lot of those BDS people are not going to stop using their GPS or cell phones. But you and I know that they're not going to be able to stop the progress of the Jewish state by boycotting them. So I believe BDS is really about setting up a global information campaign to justify the persecution of the Jews. They know they can't hurt them economically. So at the end of the day, I think this has to be about a PR campaign to vilify the Jews and therefore make it globally acceptable to be involved in anti-Semitism, even as we saw some Jewish folks killed this week again in New Jersey. We've seen the synagogue that was shot up in San Diego and in Pittsburgh, where a bunch of them were killed. So this is really BDS, I think, is about an information operation to justify and set up persecution of the Jews. What say you?
I agree 100%, and I think we ought to go behind the curtain and figure out where it's coming from. You and I have talked about this in previous shows. Maybe this is something we ought to be proclaiming from the rooftops, Brannon, and that is there is a ridiculous amount of money flowing into American colleges and universities from Arab countries who are spending, get this, over several billion, not million, $billion in endowments on major universities, of which you and all of you viewers have heard about from coast to coast, from the very top, where Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, and so on, to endow Arab chairs in Arabic history, Middle East studies, conflict resolution, and so on. But those Arab countries that are propagating these lies with huge donations, endow the chairs, write the curriculum, help pick the professors, and you often have cases, and I have hundreds of these cases that I've read about, where university professors are literally spouting the philosophies from places like Mein Kampf, from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and other horrifically anti-Semitic, anti-Israel texts, in the idea that this is some kind of scholarship. And the stories and lies they tell about Israel are being told to our impressionable 18, 21-year-old kids, none of whom have been to Israel, and none of whom know they're being lied to. Look, you mentioned Bethlehem. I've been there. I've been in the Church of the Nativity. Bethlehem 40 years ago was almost 100% Christian. There's virtually no Christians left. They've been driven out by the very radical Muslim left, and nobody was listening as the various Christian churches were being driven out. Why? Because they tell a different story. Now, the historical, I'm going to tell you the truth, and your viewers are not going to believe it. Now, the narrative coming out of the BDS movement, and in this case led by Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has made it very clear that everybody in my heritage history and in your religious heritage history was a Palestinian, including Jesus. including Moses, including Abraham. They have the audacity to rewrite history, and people don't laugh at them and tell them to shut up, you sound really stupid. People go, uh-huh, uh-huh. When the truth is, Brannon, before the late 1960s, there was no such thing as a Palestinian except someone who was Jewish. They hijacked the name. It was devised in a plan in Moscow, put together between Yasser Arafat and the KGB. They invented a historical narrative that doesn't exist for a people that has no identifying genetic or historical context at all, and created Palestinians. When in reality, before 1948, Palestinians were Jews because they lived in the land of Palestine, which is a Roman name for Judea, because the Romans wanted to rename it something that sounded not Jewish. And when Israel became a country again, they went back to their biblical names, right? And the Palestinian people who didn't exist, or the Arabs that lived there, created that fiction in the late 60s. So now, to be a persecuted minority, you need a name, Palestinians. You need a history. They've created it. You need a legacy. Well, they've made that one up too. And now they're getting the various groups around the United States and Europe to back their idiotic, invented narrative.
Absolutely.
And it's being funded.
Absolutely. And
several $1 billion over the course of the last decade.
And Barry, most people don't know that it was a Roman emperor that called it Palestine as an insult to the Jews, really referring to the Jewish enemies of the Philistines, who had not been on the scene for 600 years. They had not been around for 600 years, but the Roman emperor calls it Palestine to name the land of the Jewish people after their enemies, the Philistines. And as you said, there is no connection. Even DNA has proven the so-called Palestinians, the Arabs, there's no DNA that shows that they are from that region. They're not from that region. And even the name Palestine has nothing to do with them. It has to do with the Philistines, a group that was gone 600 years when it was given that name by a Roman emperor, Palestine, as an insult to the Jews. So you're right. They create a false narrative. And yet how many Americans, how many people of the Protestant world, evangelicals, some of them who would like to defend Israel, but they don't have the information to do it, many of them, because no one is teaching them these things. Very few people, I should say, are teaching them these things. This is just something the average American, if you asked them on the street, where does the term Palestine come from, they wouldn't have a clue what you and I just laid out.
Yeah, and the Romans called it Philistina, as you pointed out so accurately, Brannon, after the Philistines, who were the mortal enemies of the Jews. Now get this, the first leader of this made-up people, the Palestinians, who are supposed to be born in the land of Israel, the first leader of this made-up movement, as everyone knows, was Yasser Arafat. Born and raised in Egypt, an Egyptian Arab who, as a terrorist who had murdered thousands, remember he's the guy that invented hijacking and blowing up of planes with the passengers, was taken by the KGB to Moscow, where the narrative was made up. And after he had stolen billions from the world and became the richest man in Middle Eastern history, they think several billion still stashed in Switzerland, died, probably of AIDS from what I've been told. Mm-hmm. His successor, Mahmoud Abbas, who's been the president ever since he was elected in 2005 to a 4-year term. Remember, there are no second elections. You die, and then there's an election. He got his PhD from Moscow in the fact that the Holocaust didn't happen and was a plot between the Nazis and the Zionists to take over the Middle East. So he's the peace partner currently of the world for this territory, and has become, and God bless Trump for this, has become an enemy of the United States because he would not keep his word to the President of the United States when he said, I will stop taking your American aid and paying my people to kill Jews. He made the promise in the White House. He flew back to the Middle East, went to his headquarters in Ramallah, which is on the West Bank, and proclaimed proudly on the Palestinian media, I will never betray our martyrs. Our biggest part of our budget will always be to pay the Martyrs Fund. Well, for those of us that know better, we call it the Pay for Slave Fund. In other words, you want to be one of the highest paid people in the Palestinian territories, try to kill a Jew, get caught, get put in prison for 20 years. They will pay you more than a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a cop, or even a government official in the Palestinian territories. And Trump said, that's absurd, that's ridiculous, it must stop. And when Abbas broke his word, God bless Trump, he cut the money off. I hope and I pray the rest of Western Europe that seems to be sucking up to this guy gets a little bit of ethical presence and says, you know what? We're not supposed to pay the leader of a people to kill the people they live with as a budgetary expense. And it's published every year to see. Why? Because it's European and UN money, so they get to see where their money's spent. And the Martyrs Fund is the biggest single expense spending money from foreign donations. And how many of your people know that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is why we have the ATP report. It stands for American Truth Project, led by Barry Nussbaum. By the way, if you'd like to get his text alert, you can simply text the word truth to text truth to 88202. Truth, text truth, the word truth to 88202. Now you get our text alert by texting WVW to 88202. That's why I messed up there. We use the same company. We've been using it for a long time. We recommended it to Barry, and they now are with the same company we're with. Two separate text alert lists, but if you'd like to get his text alert list, he doesn't share his list, neither do we. You can always text the word stop to stop it. Just text the word truth, TRUTH, to 88202. Now, Barry, we've only got about 4.5 minutes left in this broadcast, but I want to bring up and talk about something I think Trump did the other day. I don't even know if Donald Trump knows he did this or not, but he has highlighted the hypocrisy of the left as he does over and over, and maybe he doesn't even know he's done this, because right now we have something we're fighting here in the United States of America called the Equality Act that would roll over into really the civil rights language of 1964, the LGBTQ agenda of the cultural Marxist, making them out to be a victim coalition and saying, now who's your oppressor? It's the conservatives and the Christians, because I guess apparently, someone that hires a guy with a great resume and a suit who shows up the next day in high heels and a dress, you don't want that person working in your family business. Well, you're stuck. You'll be violating their civil rights and liberties, even though they chose to do that. That's their chosen behavior. And now they want to use the Equality Act to persecute businesses and steal the freedom of speech of what we can and cannot say on radio or TV, as is the case in Canada and parts of Europe. So they're going to limit people's freedom of speech. Now, what's interesting, Trump comes out, says the Jewish people, that's a nationality. We're going to make it protected under the civil rights of America, and you can't be involved in anti-Semitism with Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, CARE on college campuses that have Hitler Week on 700 college campuses across America. They literally sponsor Hitler Week, as I detail and show video footage in my documentary, Sabotage. Now, what are they saying? USA Today headline the other day, the day after Trump's executive order, this will rob people of freedom of speech. Wait a minute. They're worried about robbing people of their freedom of speech, not to be promoting anti-Semitism and hatred toward the Jews. But if you pass the Equality Act and other legislation they have, Christians and conservatives can't speak the truth about what they believe from their own worldview related to the LGBTQ Marxist agenda. And then you have Hamas working, and Muslim Brotherhood and CARE working with Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill the last few years to craft laws that could penalize people for blaspheming the prophet, speaking ill against Islam, Islamophobia. So they don't mind stealing the free speech of Christians, conservatives, Jews, but we don't want to dare do anything to limit the freedom of speech of the Jew haters, i.e. the Marxist, i.e. the Islamist. Do you notice all of a sudden the narrative is flipped? They're worried about freedom of speech if we classify the Jews, as Trump's doing with his executive order, but they want to rob us of our freedom of speech using the LGBTQ and Islamic agenda. What say you?
Let me just make a quick comment. My children are grown, but if they were little and their school announced Drag Queen Story Hour, where grown men who look like grown men are dressed up in dresses and wigs and makeup and high heels to read fairy tales to my children, I couldn't get to that campus quick enough to pull them out.
Right.
I don't believe that we, as Americans, who have some sort of value system, I mean, even the minimalistic value system, have to put up with, well, that stuff. Having said that, freedom of speech does not include yelling fire in a movie theater. We infringe on that freedom because it can cause harm. We are infringing on the freedom, I should say, the president just has, to be anti-Semitic because it leads to things like what you talked about, synagogue shootings in Poway, California, in Pittsburgh, in what just happened in New York in a grocery store. That kind of freedom that leads to violence and persecution ought to stop. On the other hand, if we, people who love freedom, who love America, and who believe in certain Judeo-Christian values, are not allowed to say, well, here's what the Quran says. Make your own decision. Let me read to you what the Sharia calls for. Let me tell you what Muhammad's own words were. If it's the truth and you're not slandering and libeling anybody, you ought to be able to tell the truth like that and let people make their own decisions. I've been labeled an Islamophobe from simply reading from the Quran. The words of Muhammad quoting Allah, who says certain things that the Jews and the Christians are their enemies and must accept the word or face the sword. I don't think that's slanderous reading their texts. I don't think that should be infringed upon. I don't think I should advocate for violence, but at the same time, we can have an open discussion. Having said that, protecting the rights of Jewish people on campuses or being denied federal funding as a result of their anti-Semitism is not only due and appropriate, it's long overdue. And I urge your viewers to find out what's going on college campuses. They're going to think twice about where they send their children to be educated, because they're going to come out Marxists, anti-Semites, at least socialists. They'll think capitalism is some kind of scourge on the earth.
That's right.
And they won't understand why anybody would have any belief in the Bible. That's what they'll learn in college today.
And that's Barry Newsbaum. He is the host of this broadcast. ATP Report stands for American Truth Project. His website is americantruthproject.org, americantruthproject.org. Tell your family and friends about this brand new WVW Broadcast Network program with your host, Barry Newsbaum. It's going to be cutting edge. Whatever's happening in the news, we're going to bring it to you, because we can promise you you're not going to hear this from the mainstream media, which is why we exist. Again, his website, americantruthproject.org. Till next time, I'm Brannon Howse. Thanks for watching. Take care.